behalf of the Collective Impact Forum, I'd like to welcome you to today's online training, Making Meetings Work. It's great to talk to you all today. My name is Robert Albright, Director of Programs with the Collective Impact Forum. Today's online training has been adapted from a session at our 2017 Collective Impact convening that was held last May in Boston due to its popularity with attendees. We have a terrific program for you today with some great speakers and great perspectives. And before we get started, I just wanted to touch on a few quick items. Today's program is 90 minutes long, and we encourage you to stay engaged throughout. We'd like to actually start by asking you a poll right out of the gates here. We want to get you all engaged. So there's a question here that should be popping up on your screen. How many people are watching today's webinar at your location? We'll give you just a minute to fill this out. We encouraged attendees to organize viewing parties. We know that was not the case for everyone, but some of you brought in multiple attendees from the same location, which is great. So we'll pause for a moment while you select the number of attendees at your location. We'll just keep this open for maybe a few more seconds. Let's do maybe 10 more seconds, and then we'll close it out. I see some good results coming in here. Interesting. So we've got about 40% of you are watching the webinar on your own, but a good number of you, 31%, 2 to 3, and then the rest have a larger group involved, which is great. So other than polls, we also want to hear your questions and comments throughout the online training. You can submit them at any time during the presentation via the white box on the right side of your screen, and the presenters will verbally respond to as many questions as time allows during the Q&A portion at the end of the online training. So feel free to send over your questions along the way, and we'll make sure to get to as many as possible at the end. We also encourage you to join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag Collective Impact. And if you have any technical questions during the webinar, you can email customer support at Blue Sky eLearn at the email address on the screen, support@blueskyeLearn.com. Lastly, this event's being recorded, and you will receive the recording link to your email after the conclusion of today's webinar. Thank you all so much for joining, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. And now I'd like to introduce Paul Schmitz, who is a Senior Advisor to the Collective Impact Forum, and he's going to lead us through today's online training on making meetings matter. So thanks so much, Paul, and I'll let you take it from here and then also introduce the other speakers as you go. So thanks so much.
Wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those out west and further west. What we're going to talk about today is I'm going to share a couple case studies, some material from some groups that I've used before, and kind of some of the things I've learned about organizing meetings to be more effective, because in collective impact or any kind of coalition work, obviously there's a lot of meetings, and we have a lot of time we spend around tables with each other, and if we can make those more productive, more efficient, more effective, and more energizing to the whole process, it really can help the work move forward. And a lot of times what I find when I visit groups is that the meetings are a source of things that people complain about and moan about and go to the parking lot and talk about. They spend more time in the parking lot talking about the meeting than they spent in the actual meeting. And so what we want to do today is kind of share some things I've learned along the way about organizing meetings to not do that. But to start, what I'd like to do is I'd like to understand from your perspective why meetings suck. And so what I'd like you to do is in the Q&A box, which is Q and A, you now are the A. And I'd like you to share some of the things that you've noticed about or experienced that make meetings just really suck and be hard to deal with. All right, boring, too long, no agenda, unclear outcomes, going off track, people monopolizing the conversation, don't starting and ending on time, no decisions are made, no preparation, it's too long, lack of agenda, lack of decision-making, too much talking, disorganized, wrong people in the room, no direction. You guys really have a lot of expertise in this. It appears there's a lot of answers. No snacks. That's always important. So lots of great stuff here, and yes, or I should say lots of sucky stuff here. But we have a lot of things that don't work, and we know that these things don't work, and yet we still go to meetings where these things aren't present. And so what I want to share today is how do we start to organize meetings to not experience these things. Thanks again for that list. So for this first group that I worked with, I met with a bunch of members of the organization, and when I met with the members, the things I kept hearing about why the meetings or the process weren't working was, first, we were getting too much information, that they wanted information curated, they wanted to know what was necessary and important, they were getting too much information at the meetings, and they didn't know what to do with all of it or how to act on it. The meetings were too siloed, that in this case, the group had subgroups, and people kind of stuck to who they knew and stuck in their lanes and their silos, and kind of that never broke up in the meetings. Lots of reporting, little engagement. They were doing so much great work, but they spent so much of the meeting telling everyone about each other's work that they weren't spending time actually doing work together. Power dynamics, that those with the most power in the room often dominated the conversations or could shut them down, and wasn't being addressed. And finally, no follow-up. I remember this comment that we make decisions and they go away. But kind of from one meeting to the next, there would be commitments made at the end of the meeting. The next meeting would come out with an agenda that wouldn't necessarily follow up or incorporate anything from the follow-ups of the last meeting, which tell people, well, I don't really need to do it because it's not going to come back. And so those were the things that I heard in talking with members of the group about why the meetings weren't working and why the process wasn't working. And so from that, I identified a bunch of design principles. And these were just as I kind of listened and thought about what would we have to design to make this work better. One of the things was we need role and expectation clarity, that there was some lack of clarity about even what the mission of this particular group was. Composition and room, that how do we organize the room and how do we compose the meeting in terms of who's there. Being really clear about purpose and goals for every meeting and for every activity within a meeting. Curating what people need, not what the presenters need. And that's an important one because I find so often, and I suffer from this too, I think that people need to know everything about what I'm doing because I'm so excited about it and it's all important to me, but I don't recognize that for the other people, they really only need to know 25% of what I think I need to share. And so how do I work to get that down to what do people need to know versus what do I feel I need to share? Engaging the full brain power of the room, that we've got all these great minds, and by having them sit and be passive, we're not engaging the power of that in the group. That time management clearly has to be at the center of it. We've got to make sure that meetings move along well. Commitments have to be held accountable. We've got to make sure that every commitment made is held accountable. And finally, prepare, debrief, evaluate, and follow up. That so often we write our agendas for the meetings, we write the agenda like 5 minutes before we're supposed to send the email out to people about the meeting. We don't think through we don't think through it very rigorously. After the meeting, we kind of see how we feel and maybe how our colleagues, we don't really evaluate it or really debrief it. And then again, the follow-up often doesn't happen because commitments are kind of made at the meeting and people hope they go away so that they're not held accountable the next time they get on board. So the first thing we worked on was roles and responsibilities. And there are a few ways you can enter into creating these. One is for every group to really identify what's the purpose of the group, who can be a member of it. Is this coalition or this collective effort, who gets to be a member of this team or committee, whatever it is, and how does one become a member? I've talked to so many groups that have they're just like, well, someone shows up, or, there's no clarity about who's a member, whether, what it means to be a member. So really defining that and defining its authority within the larger initiative. What decisions can this group make? What powers does it hold? What decisions does it have to get approval or get authorized somewhere else to do? In result-based leadership, there's this great tool called BART, Boundary of Authority, Role, and Task, that a lot of us use, that really helps to really define very clearly what is the boundary of the authority, what is the boundary of the role of this group in relation to the tasks that we have. But drafting this, there's a few ways to enter it. One way that I like to do is an activity I actually learned from Robert, who opened the call, called Triz. But one thing I've done, and I just did it for a group this morning, is I asked them to design the worst meeting possible. And I have them in groups come up with a list of things they would do to create the worst collaborative or meetings possible, and think of all the things they could put in place to make sure it was a miserable experience that they would go to the parking lot and complain about for hours. We then surface what comes back from that list, and then have people talk about where have they seen those things in collaboratives they've been part of or in the present one. And have them talk about, did they do anything to stop that, or did anyone else? Did they see any of these things change? And then finally, to look back at that first list and build a list of what are the things that you can put in place to make sure that those bad things that make meetings suck don't come back again. The tool is called Triz, T-R-I-Z, and I think it's from a place called Liberating Structures, but if you Google it, you can find it. It's a very simple tool to use. And there's other ways to get at it too, but the main thing is you want to find a way to surface from people how do they want to work together. And you want to define really clearly what the role and responsibility of membership means. What authority do you have? What decisions do you make? Where do you give decisions to others? And what are the kind of values or principles you want to hold together? So getting this clear is really important. And I did work last year with representatives from 10 coalitions in the state of Wisconsin. When they came together for one of the meetings, I asked, because they had 3 representatives from each coalition in the room, who authorized their work in this room and what decision-making can they make, and they all looked like deer in the headlights. And it's just so important to get that nailed down and clear, and it'll make everything a lot easier. The second is the facilitation, and the facilitation role is not the same as the authority role, and often it's best if the director, chair, or CEO is not the facilitator, but that someone who can hold neutral is, because that really is one of the most important parts of facilitation, is to stay neutral, to be intentional and transparent, to be very clear about the agenda you're working, and be transparent as you work through it. So if you make changes, let the audience know why you're changing it and how you're changing it. If you're moving things in the agenda, be clear. You don't want to be seen as holding hidden agendas. You want to be putting it out there. Hold appreciative openness. Welcome ideas and perspectives. Your job as facilitator is not to criticize or debate people. It's to bring out ideas. If something may be tangential or may be kind of off topic, then calling that out is fine. But in terms of the task that you have at that point, the work that you're pulling together, you want to be open and appreciative and grateful for the information you're receiving. It's important to paraphrase back, even if everyone can hear. It also helps because if you have someone who's charting the work, or if you're charting it yourself, it gives you time to write, or it gives the other person time to write. And it also is paraphrasing to summarize so that you make it easier. If I've got someone recording for me, I want to paraphrase back the statement in shorter words so that it's easier for the recorder to write. And the recorder is writing down what I say, not what the audience member says. Keep an eye on the clock. That as facilitator, a big part of this is time management and really watching time and managing time. And adjusting as need be, but adjusting based on in a transparent way. And again, really distinguishing from the authority role, that if there's a question that comes up that needs to go to the chair or leader, that you defer to that person. But it's really important that the facilitator of the meetings understands the importance of that role and holds that role, and it's not something they just take casually, but really understand the importance of holding that space. The third piece was the room. I've gone into meetings with groups where they put me at the large board table, and long tables with lots of people at them serve extroverts, they serve power, they enable people to posture and kind of hold their position and interest. it becomes, as I always joke, UN style, where people start speaking more formally even. And so I prefer roundtables when possible. I prefer groups of 4 to 6. 8, sure, but 4 to 6 is even better, more engagement, and it keeps, again, the interaction going more than when the larger the group, the more it allows kind of louder voices to dominate and quieter voices to stay quiet. I also think it's important to use table tents for names, especially if it's a group that doesn't know each other well, and to make sure that we're composing the room in a way where we're clear about where we put people. One of the things that I found is that often with groups, it can be helpful when you're dealing with a bigger group to assign seats and to pay attention to things like, well, this person has a lot of power in the room. They tend to dominate. Is there someone we can put at their table who can offset that? And even maybe if that person's not self-aware of how they dominate, ask that other person to kind of check them and to know that that's part of their role. If the person is self-aware, say, listen, we're putting so-and-so at your table, they're going to tell you to shut up if you're talking too much or whatever. But again, try and be transparent about it. Try to be intentional. Often we look at tables in terms of diversity, in terms of race and gender and even neighborhood or issue. If you've got an initiative that's multiple subgroups, maybe making sure you have different subgroups at each table. Again, kind of making sure that you're addressing any power dynamics or any loud voices with people who can kind of modulate that and bring other people into the conversation. But often if we just let people sit, they sit with the people they know and they cross-talk with each other and they have lots of side conversation, and what you want to do is break some of that up and get people into more of the space that you're trying to do. So an example of a meeting that I worked on redesigning with the group, the way that we did this, and I hold this up again as an example, not as a here is the template everyone should use. I was trying to help a group solve a particular set of problems. And so in doing so, we designed this meeting in a way that we thought would solve for those. But it wasn't meant to be, again, a template, but just an example. And if I was working with another group, I might look at it a different way. But what we decided is that before the meeting, we have an annotated agenda. We're clear, we have the results for the meeting and the agenda up on the wall. We put people in tables of 4 to 6 with assigned seats and table tents. The formal leaders will do the welcoming of people to the room. The facilitator and recorder roles are held neutral. We separate out the chair and leaders from the facilitator and make sure that's clear. Then for the welcome, the formal leader typically would open up and share the initiative result and the meeting results and agenda review. And hand it at some point to the facilitator. There's also a review on accountability for commitments made at the previous meeting, reviewing those commitments and seeing if people got those done and where we're at on those. And then also allowing the audience, the group, to check in, usually a quick icebreaker or something where we have people introduce themselves, especially as new people, but create some warmth in the room. I think with icebreakers, I ask people to stand if they're able. And I think that it's important to recognize some people standing is difficult and should be acknowledged, but generally when you have people stand and introduce, it brings energy in the room. If people do it from where they're sitting, it kind of keeps the room energy lower, and people don't project as much, and it helps with the energy of the room to ask people to stand, recognizing, again, to give people the option not to stand, but invite people and kind of encourage people to stand if they're able. Then in this case, they had 4 work groups, and the 4 work groups typically were reporting back at every meeting, and so we decided that 2 groups would report at each meeting. And again, this was a case where the groups often had so much they were excited to report about, so what we did is we limited them to 5 slides in 10 minutes. And in this case, the first slide was their goals and strategies, the second was progress, headlines on their progress, the third was headlines of their challenges, the fourth, we encouraged them to put an image and tell a story about it. The fifth was questions, 1 or 2 questions they wanted a peer consult from the group. And so the idea was to get each group to report back in 10 minutes and really give us top-line information, but really utilize, again, the brain power of the group by sharing a critical question that the group could help with. After that, there was a peer consult where we would have the tables discuss the questions that came from the two reports. That can be organized in a variety of ways. In the early months, we did this. In one case, we said, these two tables will work on this question, these two tables will work on the other, go to the table you want to work on. In another case, we actually assigned questions to tables. I don't know that there's a magic formula, but we just basically wanted to make sure that people were engaging across silos in helping solve people's problems. The important thing is that after people meet and you pull back the report backs, it's important for the person to kind of paraphrase back what they heard or learned and what commitment they're making in terms of moving that forward, so that people's kind of peer consult is accepted and kind of hopefully utilized. Then the bulk of the meeting was spent by identifying one or two big questions or issues facing the group and having the group work on that. And so having the leadership really work to identify kind of what are the big issues. Do we need to review our evaluation plan? Are we seeing data not improving in one area versus others? Has there been a big shift in the public space that we need to discuss about in the public sector or what have you? But kind of identifying what are the big issues and spending most of the time, and again, kind of framing it in front of the whole group, having table work, report out, and commitments in terms of what's next. And finally was commitments and follow-ups. What, by who, by when? Are there things from this meeting that need to be shared in other meetings? And then asking the group if we've achieved the meeting goal. And Dave, who's here from Milwaukee Succeeds, will talk in a little bit about kind of how that's adapted and organically kind of emerged over time. But that's how we initially set it out. And again, I share it as a sample that was trying to solve a particular set of problems. I always think that the form should follow the function, and that when you're clear, what are we trying to get through this committee or group and what do they need to do, let's design the meetings to achieve that. And so I wouldn't hold this up as something I would have every group do, but I think, again, it was a form that followed the functions that they needed at that time. The wireframe is an annotated agenda design that I got from working with some of the results-based leadership folks at the Casey Foundation, and have used in all my work since. It's basically a 3-column agenda. And the left column is kind of lists out the time and the result for each session. The middle kind of explains what happened, and the right is notes in terms of things like, we need to write down the goals, have communications packages on the table, handouts of roles. Paul arrived 10 minutes early. And so what we do is we make sure that everything is clear, who does what when. The minutes for each part are clear. And it really is just a very detailed, annotated agenda. And the facilitator and the leadership have this, so everyone's following along. Now, the participants don't have this. They have a public agenda, which will be a much more brief agenda. But we're clear about, again, what the time breakdown is, so we're managing time to it. We're clear what happens at each part of the agenda. And we're clear about the roles of the staff on the right and what staff are doing at any given point. Is someone recording? Is someone putting up a slide? All of that is made clear. And that's what a wireframe is. I encourage it as a great way to build agendas for meetings. And again, the most important thing is for every part of the agenda, what's the result of that? What do you want to walk out of that section with? What time are you allocating to it? And to really break down that time within the activities and be clear about what's going to happen during that time so that you are managing it effectively. Finally, there's evaluation. And again, simply putting a 1 to 5 scale in front of people, asking if the meeting achieved its stated goals, if the process worked. But why not just do a quick evaluation at the end of the meeting? And it doesn't mean you have to do it every time, but it's helpful just to get a sense of, is the energy in the room good about what we've done and what we've tried to accomplish? In terms of follow-up, and Marsha has done a great job with this from the United Way of Milwaukee and their Life initiative on infant mortality. I always joke because in this case, I'm a board member of the United Way and serve as a volunteer co-chair of a committee. And Marcia went through a training and started applying these tools, and all of a sudden I was being held accountable for all this stuff. And I felt like I'd created Frankenstein in a way. But it's awesome because what happens is after the meeting, there's commitments. And in this case, the chairs and members of the committee are emailed back a form that shows what the commitments are, when will the process start and end, and why is it a priority. And this doesn't get sent once. It gets sent a few times. And you can't come to a meeting and say, I didn't know I was supposed to do that, because you are then lying. Because you receive multiple communication, and the agenda has it in there, everything has it in there. And so, again, for those of us who are volunteers in this effort, in my case, a co-chair of a committee, you can't escape your responsibility. And and if you do, you got to kind of say what that is. So, again, just making sure that the follow-up isn't like at the next meeting you tell people, did you meet your commitment, but that you're following up in between. And ideally, if you've got enough backbone capacity, you're supporting people to fulfill those commitments as well, but making sure that those things get done. And so finally, when you think about the things that suck that we started at, the design factors I would kind of propose that I think are helpful in thinking about organizing meetings are, again, role expectation and clarity, composition of the room and how the room is set up, purpose and goals for every section of the meeting and the meeting overall. Curate what people need, not what you need. Engage the full brain power of the room, manage time effectively, make sure that commitments are stated, public, and accountable. And then prepare for the meeting, build that nice annotated agenda. Ideally, before the meeting, run through it together and make sure everyone's on the same page. Make sure you've got that neutral facilitation. Debrief the meeting. Recognize if there's dynamics in the room. Someone looks upset or seems off, maybe contact them to follow up. Evaluate if the meeting's achieving its results and people are feeling good about how you're doing. And again, just keep debriefing. So those are some of the things I've learned and done in terms of trying to pull together meetings that make a better difference. I'm now going to ask Dave and Marcia to share a little bit about their experience. Dave is with Milwaukee Succeeds, which is a Strive model in Milwaukee, doing cradle to career collective impact in Milwaukee. Marcia's with the Lifecourse on healthy families, which is an effort that is working to reduce infant mortality in Milwaukee through the United Way. And I'll start with Dave and have Dave just reflect a little bit about what he's learned and seen from kind of doing some of this work.
Sure. So, and it was helpful to hear Paul kind of run through that example because that, it's the one that speaks most directly to me. So I had already created some notes, but furiously creating notes in the margins of my notes.
It's an annotated agenda.
Yeah, it is. There you go. One of the questions that Paul had put out there to us was, how does applying some of these tools help with attendance and engagement in meetings and then the productivity between meetings? And for me, in terms of sequencing out attendance, engagement, and productivity, it does start with engagement. And that has been something that, as the quality of our meetings has increased, and there has been and that's been a result of a focus on engaging our, team members, through in those meetings. That has built momentum. That has created a meeting that people don't want to miss, which has increased the attendance of those meetings. And then it's created this positive cycle that has yielded increased productivity. But it has been a continuous improvement model. So Paul, a year and a half ago, had come in and created this template that he just ran through regarding kind of how we wanted to make this shift into a meeting that doesn't suck. That has been a template, but we have adapted it. So the roles and responsibilities that he had cited as one of those design factors was paramount for us. There was a lot of ambiguity. People were coming to meetings, but they weren't sure what they were why, what their authority was or what their role in that meeting was. So clearly articulating that was the first move for us. And then from there, the decreasing in report outs was kind of soon thereafter. So the adaptations that we've made, connected to the decrease in report outs was, as Paul had mentioned, 2 of our work groups would provide an update or kind of a status update to the larger group at every meeting. But then we were finding that in order to get everything into a 2-hour meeting, it was a great deal to manage. So we've made better use of pre-reads as a big piece of that. And nobody wants to do pre-reads because it feels like homework. But that freed up more time in our meetings, and for us, time was our most valuable commodity when it came to meetings. But then kind of the other adaptations that we've made, the need to facilitate commitments has been a big piece for us. It's one thing to say, we need to make commitments, and then there needs to be continuity across the meetings, so reminding folks of commitments and starting each meeting with commitments that had been made, or those standing commitments. But in order to kind of build that into the culture of a group, again, that required some facilitation and some growing pains, if you will. The big piece that we've discovered in terms of building productivity between meetings has been in relationship building. So it's not enough just to convene a group once a quarter or once a month and then communicate by email, but the personal and professional commitments with group members, especially with collective impact. You've got, for us in this one meeting, about 30 different people from about 20 different organizations. So it's easy for this work to get lost. So we've made time, and that was something that I had started personally over a year ago, meeting with and connecting directly one-on-one with each person on our operations team, which is the example we're talking about here. And that's been huge in terms of not just increasing engagement and attendance, but then feeling the need and the desire to commit to the collective good, or the mission that we have here. And then that all goes back to the roles and responsibilities piece that we had opened up with. That has provided greater guidance. So that everyone's coming to a meeting knowing what they're expected. Because for us, we are cradle to career, and we've got early childhood folks in the same room with post-secondary enrollment folks, and with individuals who are working for youth-serving organizations. So when you drill down into specific work group work, one of the challenges was a feeling as if I as an individual might not necessarily have anything to offer. So we've had to be very intentional in how we are framing our essential questions during those report outs, in making it clear to everyone, what their role is, and that role is really to, again, provide guidance in a critical response format, and to help validate decisions across the continuum.
Hey, Dave, this is Robert. I wanted to jump in real quick. We're going to take questions more formally at the end, but there was a specific question that came in that I thought maybe you could just respond to, since it was specifically about your presentation. Someone was asking just for more context on how many people are usually in attendance at your meetings. Could you respond to that briefly?
Sure. So we have a group of right around 30 plus or minus a couple of individuals, and on any given meeting we usually have over 25 people there. So in a group that big, you're going to have a few people that aren't going to be able to make it because of logistical reasons. But that has been a change where, when I first started, we didn't have a 80% plus attendance rate when it came to our meetings.
Great. Thanks, Dave. Marcia, how have you applied some of this stuff in your work?
Sure. So just to give some context, the Milwaukee Lifecourse Initiative for Healthy Families, or LIFE, the collaborative, we have 3 action committees, and then as well as a steering committee. Usually attendance is around 10 to 15. Steering committee is usually a little bit more, around 20 people or so. And we convene those meetings about every other month. And then we also have quarterly convening meetings, which are actually open to the public, but special invites go to around 500 people or so on our listserv. We usually have around 50 to 70 attendees for those, and those happen quarterly. So we have incorporated a very similar agenda template to our meetings. Previously, our meetings, we just had a subject line for the agenda item and who was the lead on it. We didn't have any time limits listed, no outcomes were listed for each of the agenda items. And I think that led to a lot of blending of agenda items, really some miscommunication as to what the actual action steps were coming from those meetings. So I think just having our collaborative goal listed on our agenda and stated verbally by our facilitator, as well as having the committee, if we're talking a committee, we have our committee work group charge on that agenda, and then the anticipated results for the meeting as well. I think that really helps motivate active or motivate current committee members, but it also provides a really helpful orientation for first-time attendees as well. We often will have committee members that have a colleague that they're, inviting to one of our meetings as well. So it helps provide a little bit of orientation. And then just for an example, with our steering committee, we also have used kind of a results-based facilitation method, evaluation tool at the end. I know Paul had mentioned kind of on a scale of 1 to 5 whether or not results have been accomplished. We kind of give 3 options. Were results accomplished? Was there some progress made? Or did we not meet the result for that meeting? I think that piece in particular has helped to kind of show the process and trust that our members have in the convening agency. That's been helpful for Reportouts, even to our funder as well, to kind of use that process evaluation as well. I will say one of the other pieces that Paul mentioned was that grid that I do email out about a week after the meeting with action items listed. And then I will say what's also key to that is that staff also needs to be listed, if they have action items from that meeting. Certainly that I think that fosters a level of trust and commitment between our volunteer committee members as well as the staff. And then certainly as a staff person, I've found it helpful to incorporate that into my workflow then, so that I'm also clear on what was discussed at the committee. And then as Dave had mentioned, having those action items for the committee members, but then for staff, as a staff person, it's really helped to spur, I think, more productivity between meetings for those follow-up information fact-finding meetings or calls that, to basically assure that movement is happening on the strategies. And I will just say, another example is that one of our teams actually was able to shorten meetings after using this process from 90 minutes to 60 minutes because the meetings were just more streamlined and everyone knew what to expect coming into the meeting. And then I think also Paul asked us to share any other tips or any other components that have been helpful to strengthen attendance, engagement, and productivity. Certainly sticking to the assigned time is helpful, and having that on the agenda, I think it provides a little bit of a shared understanding around the facilitator, note-taker, and the people in the space. But I also think sticking to time is helpful for engaging new members, because if you're first time coming to a collaborative meeting, you see that people are using their time and energy well and effectively. And then I think another piece with those new members is really assuring that a staff or a co-chair introduces themselves, welcomes a new member before or after the meeting as well. I think that is the one place where maybe a short meeting can be helpful, just to help welcome and orientate that person to roles, responsibilities as well. And then just the other tip that I would mention would be, and kind of Paul's agenda template example that he provided, I think included this, where meetings ideally are most effective having a mix of presentation, info sharing, reporting out, but also having some level of action, activity. I know for the quarterly convening meetings that we host, which is our larger 50 to 60 person meeting, we almost always have a time section of our meeting that's dedicated to purposeful small group, partner, charting activities. We use a lot of Post-its, flip charts. Just having that level of engagement, I think is also important.
Great. Well, thank you. And I came up with an acronym for your accountability email, the NAG. Normalizing accountability for the group.
Okay, I like it.
But it works. So thank you, everyone. And what I'd like to open up now is I think Robert's been watching all your questions, and hopefully we'll start to dig into those, and we appreciate them. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Paul, and thanks, Marcia and Dave, and thanks to those of you who already have shared some comments and questions, and feel free to add others if you want to join the conversation. So first question, Paul, this was a comment that someone had made earlier on when you were presenting at the beginning about the facilitator's role, and one person was making the note when you were talking about the facilitator's role to hold neutral, that in some instances this person had said that it can often be helpful for the facilitator to challenge the group, particularly when you're digging into issues around equity or disparities in a community. So talk a little bit about how you've seen facilitators effectively balance the need to be neutral, but maybe at other times have a defined point of view or challenge the group when needed.
So I think that the point of view should be defined by the results, and that the facilitator's job is to deliver the results. And so if one of the results is if people are raising things that are go against principles the group has agreed on, then it's okay to say, wait a second, I think I want to hold here because we've agreed as a group that this is a principle we hold within our collective, or this is one of the key priorities of our initiative. And I think holding those is still being neutral. Neutral doesn't mean that you don't have opinions or points of view, because we all have that. And sometimes what I've also seen is I've seen facilitation where someone takes off the neutral hat for a moment and comes out and just declares themselves, I need to kind of take off my facilitator hat for a moment and just weigh in here. And it's not something someone should do often, but I've been okay with it when I've seen it. I think I've done it a few times. But then again, making that intentional and transparent, not just floating into it, but saying, hey, I need to step out of my neutral for a moment. Just I do have an important point I want to make here that I think will help the group move forward. And again, it should always be in service of the group moving forward, not just getting into a debate with somebody. Hopefully you have a group that there are other people that can debate each other in the group, that you don't need to be the one standing up. I mean, if no one else in the group is standing up on an issue of equity, for example, or racial equity that someone may raise, then that's a problem with your group, because hopefully you've got a group where other people have raised those issues as well, and your job is to facilitate that. But if I feel the need, I would take off the neutral hat, but again, do so very intentionally and very transparently, and then I would say, okay, I'm going back into neutral, and I appreciate you letting me do that. But just kind of owning and acknowledging that you're making that shift.
Great. Thanks, Paul. We've got a couple other good questions coming in here. Another one that someone asked, do you have a recommendation on the optimal length of time for a meeting? This could be for you, Paul, or Marsha or Dave, if you want to weigh in, I'm assuming it may vary based on the purpose of the meeting and size, but why don't you all take that one?
Again, I think form should follow function. It's like, what are you trying to get done? And what do you think that the attention span of your audience can hold? 2 hours is a lot to ask of a group. There's no question. And I think that 2-hour meeting Dave's talking about is over lunch, and they serve lunch, which makes it a little more approachable. But I think you kind of have to know your group and know what they can kind of, what your group can handle and what is necessary to achieve your results. What you don't want to do is keep having 60-minute meetings where you only get through half your agenda and you're always not, then you've got a problem. But at the same time, if you've got a 90-minute meeting that ends early, people don't complain if you end at 70 minutes. They're not like, oh, damn, I wanted to keep going for another 20 minutes. They get to stop for coffee on the way back to the office or answer a few more emails. And so I think it's always better to schedule a little more than what you need, so you're not running over, but running ideally even a little under. But you got to kind of follow, and as I said, you have to look at what results are you trying to get, and is it conceivable to achieve those results in that amount of time. I see a lot of agenda crowding, which is another big issue where groups just like they want to get like 9 things done in 60 minutes that are just each of which is a 15 or 20-minute topic at least to get any kind of engagement around. So you got to be careful about not overpacking it. And so it's sometimes you might decide we need longer meetings, sometimes you might need shorter agendas. I don't know, Dave and Marcia, what do you think?
I would agree wholeheartedly, especially with that last point. Totally claim ownership of that. Definitely put together some agendas that were overly ambitious, and we were trying to pack too much into too short of a time, even if that time was a 90-minute meeting or a 2-hour meeting, or sometimes we'll have day-long meetings if we really need to go deep on a specific topic and come out with an action plan. So definitely sometimes less is more, and that's a lesson that we have learned, and we really try to adopt a culture of learning here, and the evaluations are definitely help guide that. But we just had a meeting of our operations team back in July that many people were saying was the best one yet, and the agenda was light. We only had a couple of topics on there. We cut some stuff because we really wanted to not just go deep on something, but get to a result. And you can't do that if you've got too much going on, and that's something that we've had to learn the hard way. Anything to add?
No. Great. Next, Robert.
Great. Thanks. And Dave, to follow up on what you were just saying, a specific question for you when you were presenting. Someone had wanted a little more clarification when you were talking about report outs, and you had made reference to the fact that that might be something that no one wants to do. I think the person who was asking that question might have broken up a little bit when you were speaking to that. Talk a little bit more about how you've approached report outs, how you've addressed maybe pushback from folks on how they've been structured before and how they're structured now.
Sure. So, the structure before was the traditional report out that everyone can think of. Somebody preparing a PowerPoint that has too many words on too many. So we shifted away from that, and a practice that we've adopted is really critically thinking about and asking each other, what is it that people need to know? So Paul made the point earlier that we think is important and is critical to communicate it's probably not as much. It's probably a small percentage of what we think people need to know is what they actually need to know. So we will go over every meeting together. Anyone who's presenting, we have walkthroughs. We work with each other, and we distill things down to what is essential. And if there's information that we think is people need to know that isn't making the cut or is a nice to know, we will pack that into pre-read material and send that along. So at a minimum, everyone has that on file as a reference that they can go back to. But then when we were actually reporting out, Paul went through, we've got 5 slides in 10 minutes. And we've adapted that a little bit where we're adopting we're actually reporting out on a little bit less information, and then taking some more time for more of, I don't know if it's an officially coined term, but critical response process is something where the questions or the peer consult that Paul had mentioned, it really boils down to asking one or two essential questions of the group. And we've adopted this process of critical response where we ask questions of the group. The group provides a number of really kind of powerful, meaningful questions in response to that. And then we go through a cycle where we focus in on one of those specific questions that's really resonated with the work group that was asking the first essential question. And then we go deep and get guidance and advice from the group there. And that's been helpful not only for getting information or providing guidance to the individual asking or providing the report out, but also it's been helpful in engaging the entire operations team. So as I had mentioned, we've got people from cradle to career, people in school, out of school, from healthcare to education to for-profit chambers of commerce. Some of them, they have expertise in certain areas and others they don't, but this process has allowed everyone to engage and to just use their intelligence to participate in the process.
Great. Thanks, Dave. And this is a question for anybody to jump in on. There's two questions that came through around the level of commitments that you get from these meetings and how you hold people accountable to those commitments. So maybe, Marsha, you want to start on that one, and then Paul or Dave, you can jump in. So just more clarity or examples on the types of commitments and the ways that you have been able to hold people accountable to those commitments.
Sure. So I think one important piece is to read back the commitments. I'm usually kind of the role of note taker at our committee meetings, so verbalizing what I've heard and what I understand are action commitments made by those at the meeting, and then include those in the notes in kind of in an action item format of task, person, assigned, and then a when, by when, date. And then I think also another important piece in that is also why. Why did you commit to be doing this, or how is it moving our strategy forward? I think it's also can kind of help be a little bit of a motivating piece. And then I think it's important to not just include that in the agenda notes, but also in the body of the email that you send out of the notes to the group, because often people will, just be scanning through emails, so it is important, I think, to just have that included. I usually try to get those out about a week after the meeting, and definitely follow up then, 2 weeks out from the next meeting. And then I think, as needed, if there are kind of additional follow-up needed in between meetings, I think as staff, that's if you have the capacity to do so, that's part of the role.
So as a co-chair, if I'm not fulfilling my commitments, would you go to Natalie, who's the director of it, and say you need to talk to that co-chair? Is that what, I'm wondering how you would.
I think part of it is.
I haven't gotten that call yet, so I'm feeling good about it, but I'm just wondering, if you're not getting it done, do you escalate it in that kind of way?
Well, I think what helps spur it sometimes is looking at the next agenda for the next meeting, is that you can see, hey, we're putting together the agenda for the next meeting, can we expect this? And I think being a little bit reasonable, for us, it's, all of our committee members are volunteers. So also being respectful that, okay, it's maybe not getting done quite by this when by date. Well, when do you think that you are going to be able to accomplish that commitment? Or is there some sort of barrier as to why it's not really going through? Is there someone else that we need to be contacting to follow through with a commitment? I think having that level of flexibility is helpful. I think at least in our situation, just having volunteer members as part of our committee. It's just a part of the process to some extent.
Great. Thanks, Marcia.
Another thing I'll add is it's really good to have co-chairs.
Say that again, Paul. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, I said I think it's also very good to have co-chairs, and and especially if you can find ways to kind of yin and yang that in the sense of, my coach, I'm kind of on the road a lot and kind of my schedule will flux. My other co-chair is like really detail-oriented and like there every time, and so like we play well together, and I do more of the facilitating. She does more of the kind of driving, and I think sometimes it's, choosing good co-chairs makes a difference too in this kind of work that balance each other.
Paul, this next question is related to that point about the importance of co-chairs. Someone asked, what do you do in a situation where you don't have the resources for a dedicated facilitator that might be a consultant or dedicated backbone staff capacity to play that facilitator role? Any suggestions on how you build that facilitation muscle within those that are around the planning table? Are there other ways that you can accomplish some of what you've described without having the dedicated staff or outside facilitator or consultant come in and play that role?
Yeah, I mean, if you're the facilitator, then hold the roles as we talked about earlier. And so I think that ideally, if you have, I think in Marsha and Dave's case, they're staff people with backbone entities. In other people's case, it's the co-chairs. With the Life Committee, the co-chairs actually facilitate the meeting, but we have a clear agenda and we're clear about what times and things we have to get accomplished. And so I think it really, I don't know that you need to have a paid facilitator or consultant. I think it's just, again, playing the role and being clear about the role and what the role means. That if I'm facilitating the meeting as co-chair, my job is not to try and debate people and kind of get my agenda. My job is to help the group accomplish its result for the meeting. And if I'm clear that my agenda has to come second in the meeting, and that my opinion might even come second in the meeting, that my job is to help the group accomplish its result. It's really, I think the thing is, remember, it's a servant leadership role. And it's not a directive role, it's a servant leadership. You're in service to the results of the group in the meeting, and your job is to accomplish those results and to help the group accomplish those results, not for you to get your way.
Great point. Thanks, Paul. This next question, feel free, any of you, to take this. Maybe some specific examples or recommendations for a meeting icebreaker or any other tips on just freshening up meetings and making them more engaging.
There's books of icebreakers. You can just Google icebreaker and you'll see 100. I mean, this morning we used what's your favorite thing about fall, and it told us a lot of different things about people.
We've also done at larger meetings when we're sitting at tables, turn to the person next to you, chat about, with an icebreaker between the two people first, and then after that's done, then we actually have people introduce each other as well, which I think can help for kind of a smaller group relationship building type environment.
Yeah, and the standard practice that we've adopted that kind of helps when it comes to the check-in is greater use of data walks. So making sure that data is at the center of our discussions. That's just kind of part of the ethos of our partnership. But when you put data on the walls and then you ask at the beginning of meetings for attendees to get up and look at the data, and some of that could just be a check-in on, long-term data that we care about, our core indicators. Some of that could be an update on a specific project that we ran. So we ran a PDSA, and what were the results of that, and what are we learning, as a consequence. And that helps with the energy of the room. It gets people engaged right out of the gate. And then it provides an opportunity for to do a check-in do the data walk first, and then it's a built-in check-in where you can ask, so what resonated with you, or what stood out, what surprised you, what enrages you, anything and everything. You can go in a lot of directions, and it's baked into the agenda of the meeting.
Yeah, I like it too, because so often the worst thing you could do in a meeting is a data presentation. And the worst thing you can do is have a data analyst give a data presentation. Because, I mean, if it's like watching the weather report and all you want to know is the temperature and when it's going to rain, and also the commercial hits and you got so zoned out when they were talking about barometric pressure you missed what you wanted to know. You really, data walks are a great tool. I always have people do it in pairs and give them questions, so that and usually a pair of someone they don't work with, again, because then they're talking about it with somebody, answering questions, and they're engaging with the data versus passively listening to it. And so it's a great tool and activity to do. So again, I think that just finding ways, and for icebreakers, you can look up ones. And I like Marcia's idea. I've done, paired conversations, and then have people introduce their partner, give them 3 questions. So there's a lot of ways you can do that. But I think, again, have people stand if they can. It adds energy, also projects out more. And it just, again, you're trying to build energy in the room as you start a meeting and get people to know each other and get people to laugh a little bit and just warm up the room.
Thanks for that. So one other follow-up resource, as you all are talking about data walks that folks may be interested in, there's a guide to facilitating intentional group learning that some colleagues of mine at FSG came out with recently that talks about data walks and some of these other tools that have been referenced. So you can find that. We can also send the link out in the Q&A box. But it provides just some tips. If you are a facilitator or know of someone that is facilitating a meeting, that could be a helpful resource that provides links out to a lot of other great resources on those topics. One other question, there's so many good questions here. I'm trying to bucket them as best I can. So one kind of group of questions are, how do you prepare people for uncomfortable conversations? So, for example, if you're going to confront issues of race and racial equity, for example, that's not necessarily going to be a feel-good conversation. That might be a really challenging conversation. So how do you prepare groups for uncomfortable conversations, and then not only preparing for but entering into those conversations? Any tips on how to confront those challenging questions but needed questions in meetings?
Yeah, I think that one of the books I found really helpful in thinking about that kind of work is The Practice of Adaptive Leadership by Heifetz and Linsky and Grashow, The Practice of Adaptive Leadership. And one of the things they talk about is that a leader in a group doing kind of adaptive work, which is what that kind of is, kind of keeps their hand on the thermostat of the room. And they have to know how to turn up the heat and turn down the heat on the conversation to kind of keep the right amount of tension in the room where it's productive, because you can build a tension in the room that becomes unproductive, and you can have a room that's too polite. So you want to have the right amount of tension in the room. And there are a number of things you can do to, kind of, if the room's too comfortable, kind of raise a provocation. You can call a hard question. You can name a dynamic in the room and kind of say, like, this is what we're not talking about, and here's what it means. There's a number of ways to turn up the heat. There's also ways to turn down the heat. You can decide to break the problem up into smaller ones. You can call a break. You can find a way to insert some humor. There's ways to kind of hold it, but what you want is you want the right amount of tension so that the group is getting to what it needs to do, but not so much tension that kind of breaks. And so it's hard to kind of answer that in a minute. There's like a whole other day-long workshop to learn that stuff, but it's important work. Another book I found really helpful is the book Difficult Conversations, and it's just called Difficult Conversations. And just recognizing a lot of times what we need to do is walk through a process with a group to kind of make sure we're operating with the same interpretations and assumptions before we build any solutions on that. and how do we work back to understand where people's stories are coming from or where our stories are coming from, and work to bridge those stories. And but that's a very, it's a complex question. It's hard to answer it simply, but I think the main thing is I'm conflict averse, so those make me uncomfortable, but I've had to learn how to kind of manage that in a way, and you do need to kind of keep your hands on the wheel. Either of you have anything to add on that?
No, that's spot on.
Yeah.
Great, and continuing on this thread of challenging situations or maybe difficult dynamics in a meeting, another question someone asked was any tips for encouraging dominant attendees to take less space in the room? And someone else asked, kind of along this thread of difficult dynamics, just any tips on how to manage microaggressions in a meeting. So either of those, not necessarily directly the same question, but falling in line around this topic of confronting challenging dynamics in meetings.
Well, I mean, for us, we don't have a boardroom. We've got, we set up the room in a way that tries to neutralize that to a certain extent, as Paul had mentioned earlier. So we will have about 4 to 6 tables that are set up, and that helps for the reasons that Paul had cited earlier. But we are intentional about, who is sitting with whom, and trying to see if there are strong personalities that we can help neutralize some of that, or kind of have them neutralize each other. That's been a tactic that we have taken. But the last thing that comes to mind, something that I mentioned earlier is that, relationships is a big piece of this. And that's something that I personally have learned. My background's in, quality management, and I love spending time in Excel and, coming together, bringing great plans together, and that's my wheelhouse. And, that's kind of what got me to my current position. But what I've needed to learn within my current position in order to grow is the need to kind of get out of the office and to get around to a lot of coffee shops in Milwaukee and spend a lot of one-on-one time with individuals. And that relationship building has paid dividends because it has created the opportunity for some difficult conversations. When, there have been times where, there's been a need for me to say to an individual, hey, I need you to do this in this meeting. And they've been more receptive to that because we've built that relationship. So that's again, another tactic that I could say. In terms of the microaggressions, that necessarily, we haven't tackled that yet. It hasn't been something that has come up. So I'd be definitely interested in learning more about, what options are there.
I think on our end, there's a level of discussion that we do have with our co-chairs before kind of larger meetings, and as staff kind of will notify co-chairs or the facilitator if we anticipate, some potential difficult conversations or discussions around an agenda item. I think that at least, having that prepared can help at least the facilitator, co-chairs be more aware of and sensitive to things that might come up.
Yeah, I think that, and those are both, I think, great piece of advice. I do think that one of the things you can do is, I remember one of our early meetings when I was working with Dave's group, his boss said to me, when we did the debrief, she's like, okay, I got to take so-and-so out for coffee. Like, it is also recognizing if someone is triggering that in a meeting or weighing that, you got to go talk to them. Mm-hmm. And that, that's part of why you debrief the meeting is you look, is there someone who's kind of screwing up? But we also were clear. We were very clear there were 3 or 4 kind of semi-disruptive people in the group. Mm-hmm. And so we were always kind of watching those tables and kind of working on how we organize. And all those people were essential to the process, right? So it's not like but we have to do it. I've also seen groups kick people out I've seen collective impacts that have fired people from the collective because they were just there to disrupt. I mean, they didn't get past. They were holding the group back from its goals. In terms of microaggressions, I think where possible, those can be, I think to Dave's point, you might start by having a one-on-one with someone about it, but you might also just have to call it out in a meeting if it's something that really is again, you're in service to the group achieving its results together. And if you see something that may cause offense or challenge to a group of people in the meeting that could harm their ability to move to the result with us, you got to kind of name it and work on that. And those are kind of decisions you got to kind of make in the moment. Is it something I need to call out now? Is it something I can call it later? Do you cut somebody off? And, certainly as facilitators, we have to do that sometimes. And that doesn't mean you're not being appreciative or neutral. It means that you're serving the group. And serving the group doesn't mean serving each individual's interest in the group. It means serving the group's purpose. And so if someone's going on and is off on a tangent, you got to say, excuse me, we've got 5 more minutes for this topic, and I think this is something that, can you sum it up in the next 10 seconds? We really need to move forward. That's not, again, being neutral doesn't mean you're just an empty vessel. You're serving the goal, and your purpose is the goal, not making each person happy.
Thank you for each weighing in on those related questions. There were a couple questions that came through about the peer assist approach. Paul, I think maybe you had referenced it in your part of the presentation, but someone was asking for specific examples of the peer consult questions that often come up and just how you actually approach that and use that as a facilitation approach to draw out the wisdom around the table.
Okay, Paul's waving to me to jump in on that one. So for us, just some additional context, we have 4 work groups. One is focused on kindergarten readiness from birth to 5. Another is on K-12 success from kindergarten through 12th grade. A third is on post-secondary success. And then a fourth is dealing with out-of-school time, specifically around the issue of social and emotional learning. So we have 2 of those groups report out at each one of our meetings. The peer consult is an opportunity to either provide guidance where the group is stuck and there's a need for fresh eyes to come in and get them unstuck, or if there is a need for making a decision. So within our partnership, our operations team, so that's the example that we're talking about here, their role is really to help make decisions. So they are a level within our leadership, but they are not our executive committee. Executive committee is thinking more about strategy and what's happening 5 years from now. The operations team it's about the day-to-day operations of the partnership. So a recent example involved developmental screening. So our kindergarten readiness work group had reported at our most recent meeting about a pilot project they had done with the Medical College of Wisconsin to try to build the capacity of healthcare providers as well as child care centers to provide more developmental screenings in order to identify needs for interventions earlier before children get into the K-12 system. And what they were looking for was both guidance on next steps, because as that pilot project comes to a close this December, they wanted to understand operationally where to go, and they wanted to do that 6 months out. But then also they were looking for some decision-making around the commitment of our partnership for that specific issue. So when Milwaukee Succeeds was first launched, we had a few different contributing indicators that were identified in the kindergarten readiness space. Developmental screenings was not one of them, but this was something that through the collective impact process had been identified, and then there was an opportunity to work on it in partnership with the medical college. So what that group wanted to know was what is the commitment of the partnership, vis-a-vis developmental screenings moving forward. So the essential questions that were asked was something to that effect. What is the commitment of this partnership for supporting developmental screenings beyond this pilot project? So the essential questions, we do spend a really good amount of time, and I will go back and forth. Each one of those 4 areas is managed by a goal manager, and I work directly with them, and we will go back and forth when it comes to the design of their time on the agenda. And I'll, provide some insight or some guidance or some recommendations, and we'll go through multiple iterations of those questions so that they are specific, they are directly connected to the result, and that they're meaningful. They're something that the operations team should deal with. But it's, as Paul had said, the investment of time on the front end definitely pays dividends. So I hope that answered the question.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dave. I appreciate you providing more detail on that. There's a couple questions that have come through about the importance of resident voice or those with lived experience. So this one person specifically said, can you speak about the role of resident voice in facilitating and service to the goal of the group? And someone else mentioned that an equity issue important to acknowledge is that the people in the room who are being paid to be there and those who are not, that can create kind of a challenge from a facilitation standpoint if the communities you're trying to serve are not well reflected or represented around that table. So any reflections, tips there as it relates to how to make meetings work in such a way that those with lived experience are actively around that table and decision-making is shared, not just among the system professionals per se, but those actually who live in the communities?
When groups build the linkage of resident / lived experience, but let's just say intended beneficiaries, their families, friends, and neighbors is how I often think of community members when we talk about that. We're not talking about agency leaders, we're talking about the intended beneficiaries and their families, friends, and neighbors. When we engage them in groups, I think the key thing is that there has to be work to orient them properly and effectively, build some capacity, if necessary, to make sure that facilitation happens inclusively. To have, I saw this in a group once where they had someone whose role was jargon police, and anytime they heard jargon and acronyms, they would kind of spell it out at the table so that these people, that the community members did not have to kind of ask, what is that? And so I think what you're trying to do is just, again, be very intentional about trying to level the field. And I think it's just, and the other thing is just to recognize that when you're trying to engage people, again, with lived experience or community members, you're not trying to just get random people. You're trying to get people who have some passion about the issue and some engagement so that they're committed. There are groups that pay people to attend meetings. There's debates about that. I generally am more pro than not, but there are definitely groups out there that pay community members that say everyone else in the room is getting a paycheck for being in the room. There are some abuses of that, and there are some challenges with that, but overall I think generally it's not a bad idea. Also, you got to figure out, do we have to shift things? And Marcia's effort has done more of that work, both at the level of the overall steering committee, but also in the convenings, and they've actually shifted times and things, and maybe you can talk more about that.
Yeah, so with our group, we have changed 2 of our quarterly convening meetings to evening times, from 5:30 to 7:30, and then we have 2 that are from 2 to 4, to kind of accommodate various schedules that might be there. And then as far as our steering committee goes, we have now kind of readjusted how we're going about recruitment for community members, now offering a small or a gift card, and then we also provide travel reimbursement and child care reimbursement as well. But I think the orientation, as Paul mentioned, is really key. We have kind of a kind of meet and greet meeting that we are setting up between staff and at least one member of the steering committee, ideally prior to or shortly after the first steering committee meeting that they attend. So that gives us an opportunity to verbally talk over what the collaborative is about if they're not as familiar with it. Getting a binder. Literally, I think we have a binder, and I hate to say it, I think it has 6 pages of terminology and acronyms listed out there. But just providing a little bit more of that orientation, and then kind of what I think both Paul and David have mentioned around those coffee shop meetings, those that relationship building as well, I think can help out. I mean, also considering doing decision making in meetings that is in smaller groups starting out, or using flip chart post-its to have comments, and for people that maybe aren't as comfortable speaking in a larger group, are some other items to consider.
Great, thank you.
Great. We've got about 10 minutes left. I think we can get through a couple more questions. I'm trying to take those that are hitting on similar themes. So there's a couple questions that have come through about what not only can be done during the meeting, but what happens kind of before and after. So specifically, what percentage of a meeting's effectiveness is dependent upon the one-on-one relationship building and the pre- and follow-up between meetings? And a related question, what are some tips to really strengthen ongoing communication past the meeting itself?
Okay, so I'll jump in there. And when I think of meetings, the meeting's not the work. The meeting is a tool, and it's a way to advance the work. So the work is, those. And while work happens within meetings, and a good meeting is a meeting during which work is kind of integrated into it. It definitely goes beyond that. So it is before and it is after. So it's difficult to assign a percentage to it, but I would say majority at a minimum, overwhelming majority. And for me, as I was again kind of one of the notes I wrote down on the margins here. The work changes in kind of the way we think about, or the way we define our own work changes as a result of adopting more of these tools and taking more of this approach when it comes to meetings. And it shifts, at least for us in the backbone, from doing the work to helping others do the work, and helping our partners figure out how to apply what they're learning and take greater ownership of that, which allows us to then influence how our partner organizations are operating, and that becomes the work that we do, and the meeting is just a way to is one of many different tools to facilitate that. So it just kind of blends in, I would say. The pre-work, the meeting itself, the post-work, it's all just kind of one continuum.
Thanks, Dave. I'm going to nest a couple more questions together here. Several have come in along the lines of, if you're just getting started with collective impact, what should those first couple of meetings look like? So any tips for those who might be in the early process of coalition building, and specifically related there, anything about how to build trust and get people working together when they aren't used to working together? So just any reflections, thoughts for those on the line who might be in the early stages of building partnerships and want to make their first couple meetings really successful.
Build culture first. Is that if we start talking about the work, the strategies, the things, the content, we all go into our content expertise spaces and we go into our content self-interest. What we need to do first is build a different kind of culture. And again, there's a lot of tools and methods out there for building teams and building culture and building, and the other thing, again, is I think designing a meeting style that will be the way that you do meetings, so people know when they come into the room, this is what we do, that we start on time, we end on time, that we if we ask you for 90 minutes, you will not be here 91. If we, that our meetings engage conversation in small groups, like set the culture and how right away get people to agree on how they want to work together. Great activity for the first meeting is to do that trace activity and start building, like, how do we want to work together? What principles do we want to make sure that this group holds? And then commit as facilitators or leaders of the group that from, we heard this is what you want to have in a meeting, and these are things you say. Our job is to design meetings to make sure these things happen. But I would just say really focus there first before focus on the context of the meeting before you get the content.
Great. A couple questions have come in about how you can make meetings work in a virtual setting, or if you've got someone who might come to the meetings but isn't super engaged but might be more engaged in some sort of online follow-up component. I know, Paul, when we've talked about this before, you mentioned that it's hard to replace the value of the in-person time, but do you all have any reflections on the use of technology to either keep conversations going in between meetings, or if you've got partners that might actually not be physically close, might be in a statewide setting, for example, how you can make those conversations productive in a virtual setting?
You do what you have to do. And right, I mean, it's like, I think with the Lifecourse initiative, and I certainly as a chair have had to call in a few times when I've been on the road for meetings, and it's never perfect. It's never as good as being there. You're always a little bit, you're never 100% tuned in when you're remote either on a phone. Mm-hmm. I think Skype or Zoom or any of those is better than just conference call, because if you're actually visually in contact with people, it means you stay like fully engaged. Most of us, if we're on the phone, we look at our email, we check in on, we do, we all do it. I think everyone on this phone probably does it. Mm-hmm. And most of you listening to this webinar have checked your email or looked at your screens in the middle of this thing or checked your phones. And so, again, if you were on camera, you would probably not be doing that, though. Like if everyone saw you holding your phone in front of you the whole time. So I think that if you can have a visual to remote, that helps. And you just try, again, to do the best you can. It's never going to be as good as the in-person, but I think that visual's second best, audio only third best. And I've also been in meetings where the audio is completely disruptive and makes it really hard. Mm-hmm. And in one group they require, like, each person's got a microphone in front of them, and they have to, like, turn it on to speak because there's people on the phone. It makes it, again, more formal, slows it down. You want to be so sometimes you just got to figure out, is it keep with the people there? If there's no other choice than doing it remote, then you figure out how to make the remote thing work. But if you can do it, sometimes I've also seen groups where I'm like, for that one person calling in, it wasn't worth it.
Paul, I was inspired by your comment earlier about if we're going to have a 90-minute meeting, we need to end it at 90 minutes. So I want to transition to just 1 minute of closing remarks on my end. But before doing that, I wanted to give you each maybe one or two sentences of parting words of wisdom, either something you had said before you want to emphasize or just something else that we didn't reference, just a brief sentence or two each.
I'll just say in my closing that thank you all. Your questions were very helpful, and I'm actually going to write a narrative version of this as a kind of article that I'll put on the Collective Impact Forum and work with Tracy and Robert to get done, but including some of the comments I pulled from Marcia and Dave, as well as the questions, to add to kind of what's in the presentation, so we have something to share, and hopefully that link can be sent out soon to everybody. And just thank you. And Dave and Marsha, anything you want to add?
I think, main takeaways, if you're going to do anything or one little baby step to kind of start thinking about kind of results-based meetings would be include your collective impact goal or mission on agendas, the meeting results, and just are really kind of centering with those can be really important.
Yeah, and the last thing that comes to mind for me is just an openness to learning. I personally feel like I'm far from an expert on any of this, and in figuring it out as we go along, and just that willingness to learn, the willingness to try to improve one meeting to the next, and experiment and be open to kind of making yourself vulnerable by trying to apply a new tool can be intimidating, but definitely worth it because you only learn by doing.
Great. Well, I just want to close out here and thank Marsha, Dave, and Paul for your perspectives, and thank all of you for joining today's conversation and for asking such great questions. And also just wanted to encourage you, if you've not yet signed up, we've got 3 other online trainings offered this fall that are all reprised sessions from the Collective Impact convening a few months ago. So moving from vision to implementation, sustaining collective impact, and using data for a collective impact refresh. So please mark your calendar and join us for those trainings. And then lastly, we just wanted to make sure you all knew that you can find today's PowerPoint slides on the Collective Impact Forum website. Feel free to join and create an online profile for free there to access other materials and resources. And then please do take just a moment to complete the evaluation that will appear on your screen when you sign out of today's webinar. We really appreciate your comments and suggestions and are grateful for your time today. Thanks again, and have a great rest of the day.